Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. Behind the main building, there's a single rusty swing set in an overgrown courtyard. On still, quiet nights, one of the swings will start moving on its own, a slow, gentle back and forth. The first time, I just watched it, frozen. My boss, on the phone, he just sighed and said, "Son, you have to go outside, stand by the door, and start counting to 100, nice and loud." I asked him what to do then. He said, "When you get to 100, you yell, 'Ready or not, here I come.' Then you go back inside, lock the door, and you pray she doesn't find you." That was 3 months ago. I'm still here. My name's Danny Kowalski, and I never planned on being a night watchman at the old Danville State Hospital. Hell, I never planned on staying in Vanville at all. This coal region town sits along the Susquehanna River like a scar that won't heal, population dwindling since the mines closed. Most folks my age left for Philadelphia or Pittsburgh years ago. I should have left too. Would have, if my dad hadn't gotten sick. The cancer ate through him faster than we expected. Mom needed help with the medical bills, and my construction job in Harrisburg wasn't cutting it anymore. That's when my Uncle Teddy mentioned the security gig. "Easy money," he said, leaning against the bar at Flanagan's Tavern on Bloom Street. "Just sit there all night. Make sure nobody breaks in and steals copper pipe." The pay was decent. Too decent for watching an empty building. Should have been my first red flag. Danville State Hospital closed in 1998, leaving behind a sprawling complex of red brick buildings connected by underground tunnels. The main structure towers 6 stories above Mill Street, its broken windows like dead eyes staring down at the Geisinger Medical Center across the way. Locals call it the Old Crazy House, though most avoid talking about it altogether. My supervisor, Frank Peterzak, met me at Sheets for coffee before my first shift. Graying mustache, calloused hands that shook slightly when he lit his cigarette. He'd worked security there for 15 years, back when it was still operational. "Look, kid," he said, sliding a laminated card across the table. "There are some procedures you need to follow. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me what happens if you don't. Just follow them." The card listed 8 simple rules. I figured it was some corporate nonsense, liability protection or insurance requirements. Frank watched me read them, his expression grim. "My nephew worked there for 2 weeks last summer," he continued. "Smart boy. Pre-med at Penn State. He laughed at the rules, too." Frank's cigarette burned down to his fingers. He didn't seem to notice. They found him 3 days later, sitting in the day room on the 4th floor. Catatonic. Won't speak. Won't eat unless someone feeds him. I started the next night. The asylum sits on a hill overlooking the river, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A single access road winds up from Mill Street, past the old cemetery where they buried the unclaimed patients. During my first week, I told myself the rules were just psychological tricks, ways to keep night shift workers alert and focused. Now I know better. The security checkpoint sat in what used to be the main lobby. Frank had set up a folding table with 2 monitors showing feeds from cameras scattered throughout the complex. A space heater hummed in the corner, fighting the October chill that seeped through cracked windows. "Coffee's in the thermos," Frank said, gathering his jacket. "Fresh batteries for the flashlight are in the drawer. Radio's charged." He paused at the door, hand on the knob. "Danny, I need you to understand something. These rules aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're survival instructions." He pulled out the laminated card again. Under the header, Night security protocols, Danville State Hospital. 8 rules were typed in simple Arial font. 1. Never enter the children's ward, Building C, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. 2. If you hear singing from the basement levels, do not investigate. Turn the radio to static and increase volume. 3rd, room 237 in the main building must remain locked at all times. Check the door every hour. If it's open, leave immediately. 4. The swing in the courtyard moves on still nights. Count to 100 aloud, say, "Ready or not, here I come," then return inside. 5. If the elevator in Building A activates on its own, stand facing away until it stops. 6. Never acknowledge the woman in the blue dress who appears in mirrors after midnight. 7. The payphone in the west corridor will ring exactly 3 times each night. Answer on the 3rd ring and hang up immediately. 8. If you see lights in the windows of Building D, contact Frank immediately. Do not approach the building. "Frank," I said, reading the list again. "This is ridiculous?" "Yeah, that's what I thought too." He opened the door, letting in the sound of wind through bare trees. My first week here, I ignored half of them. Figured they were old wives' tales, stories to scare the new guy. What happened? Frank's expression darkened. Rule number 6. I looked right at her, talked to her, asked if she needed help. He touched his temple, where a scar ran from his hairline to his ear. Took 14 stitches to close what she did to me with her fingernails. Doctor at Geisinger said it looked like an animal attack. After Frank left, I settled into the uncomfortable metal chair and studied the monitors. The black and white feeds showed empty hallways, abandoned patient rooms, and the courtyard where that damn swing set waited. The building felt enormous around me. 6 floors of empty rooms and echoing corridors. At 10:30 p.m., I started my first patrol. The main building stretched out like a small city, with wings branching off the central corridor. My footsteps echoed against peeling linoleum and water-stained walls. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The children's ward occupied the entire 3rd floor of Building C. A cheerful mural of cartoon animals decorated the entrance, their paint faded and cracking. I checked my watch. 10:45 p.m. Safe to enter. Inside, tiny beds lined the walls, their metal frames rusted but still arranged in neat rows. Toys scattered the floor, a headless doll, building blocks, a rocking horse with one ear missing. The windows faced the courtyard, giving me a clear view of the swing set below. It was perfectly still. By midnight, I'd completed 3 circuits of the complex. The radio crackled occasionally with distant CB chatter from truckers on Route 11. I made myself a sandwich from the lunch I'd packed, trying to ignore the way every small sound seemed amplified in the empty building. That's when I heard the first note. A woman's voice, clear and melodic, drifted up from somewhere below. She was singing something classical, maybe an opera aria. The voice seemed to come from the basement levels, echoing through the building's ventilation system. I grabbed the radio and twisted the dial until static filled the speakers. The volume knob turned easily, drowning out the singing with white noise. According to rule number 2, I wasn't supposed to investigate, but sitting there, listening to static while a phantom voice sang in the basement, made my skin crawl. The singing stopped after 20 minutes. I turned off the static and listened to the silence that followed. It felt heavier somehow, like the building was holding its breath. At 1 a.m., I climbed to the 2nd floor to check room 237. The door was solid wood with a small window reinforced with wire mesh. A heavy padlock secured the handle, and a piece of masking tape covered the room number. Through the mesh, I could see only darkness. The lock was secure. The door was closed. I marked it on my log sheet and continued the patrol. The west corridor ran the length of the main building, connecting the patient wings to the administrative offices. Halfway down, an old payphone hung on the wall next to a bulletin board covered in faded notices. The handset looked clean compared to everything else, as if someone polished it regularly. At 1:47 a.m., it rang. The sound cut through the silence like a screen, one ring, piercing and sharp. Then silence. I approached slowly, remembering the rule. Answer on the third ring and hang up immediately. The second ring came at 1:48 a.m. exactly. My hand hovered over the handset. The third ring started at 1:49 a.m. I lifted the receiver. Hello? The line was dead. No dial tone, no static, just empty silence. I hung up quickly and backed away from the phone. By 2 a.m., I was back at the security desk, reviewing the camera feeds. Everything looked normal. Empty hallways, vacant rooms, the courtyard with its motionless swing. I avoided looking at the monitors showing the basement levels. Whatever was down there could stay down there. The building settled around me with creaks and groans, the sounds of old infrastructure adjusting to temperature changes. At least, that's what I told myself. The space heater cycled on and off, its fan motor the only consistent sound in the vast emptiness. 3 hours into my shift, and already 2 rules had proven themselves real. I wondered what the rest of the night would bring. At 2:15 a.m., the elevator in Building A groaned to life. I watched the indicator lights above the doors flicker on, one after another. First floor, second floor, third. The motor whined as the car climbed toward the top of the building, then stopped. A moment later, it began descending. Rule number 5 echoed in my mind. If the elevator activates on its own, stand facing away until it stops. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for Building A. The connector tunnel between buildings reeked of mold and standing water. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some wrapped in asbestos that hung in tatters like old bandages. My breath formed small clouds in the cold air. The elevator shaft sat in the center of Building A's main lobby. Ancient brass doors reflected my flashlight beam as I approached. The car was still moving. I could hear the cables creaking and the motor straining. The floor indicator showed it was on the 4th floor, heading down. I positioned myself with my back to the elevator doors and waited. The sounds grew louder as the car descended. 3rd floor. 2nd floor. The motor gave a final wheeze as it reached the ground level. Behind me, the doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. Footsteps emerged from the elevator. Soft, shuffling steps like slippers on linoleum. They moved past me, close enough that I felt a coolness in the air as something brushed by. The footsteps continued across the lobby, fading into the distance. I counted to 30 before turning around. The elevator doors had closed. The indicator showed the car was back on the ground floor, dormant. My log entry for 2:23 a.m. read simply, "Elevator activated, followed protocol." The children's ward was off limits until 4 a.m., so I focused my patrol on the other buildings. Building B housed the former kitchen and dining facilities. Stainless steel prep tables sat covered in dust, and the walk-in freezer door hung open, revealing empty shelves and rust stains on the walls. Building D remained dark, its windows black rectangles against the night sky. According to Rule 8, lights in those windows meant immediate contact with Frank. I kept checking, but the building stayed dormant. At 2:45 a.m., I returned to the security desk to review the camera feeds. The monitor showing the basement level caught my attention. The image was grainy, but something seemed different about the central corridor down there. Shadows appeared to shift between frames, creating the illusion of movement where none should exist. I switched to a different camera and back again, The corridor looked normal. The payphone rang again at exactly 2:47 a.m. 3 rings, just like before. I answered on the 3rd ring and hung up immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the building was listening. My thermos was half empty, and the coffee had gone lukewarm. I considered making another pot using the small machine Frank had set up in the corner, but something about leaving the monitors unattended bothered me. Instead, I pulled on my jacket and decided to check the courtyard. The rear exit led to a concrete patio overlooking the playground area. The swing set stood about 50 feet away, silhouetted against the distant lights of downtown Danville. Route 11 was quiet at this hour, just an occasional truck rumbling toward Bloomsburg or Barrick. Both swings hung motionless in the still air. I was about to head back inside when one of them started moving. The motion was gentle, almost peaceful, back and forth, as if an invisible child was enjoying a late-night ride. The rusty chains creaked softly with each arc. My mouth went dry. I pulled out my phone and called Frank's number. He answered on the 2nd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "What is it, Danny?" "The swing," I said. "It's moving." Frank sighed. "Stand by the door. Count to 100. Nice and loud. When you get to 100, you yell, 'Ready or not, here I come.' Then you go back inside and lock the door." "Frank, what am I?" "Just do it, son. Don't think about it. Don't question it. Just follow the damn rule." He hung up. I positioned myself next to the door and began counting. 1, 2, 3. My voice sounded thin in the open air. The swing continued its gentle arc, creaking rhythmically. 25, 26, 27. A breeze stirred the dead leaves scattered across the patio, but the air around the swing remained perfectly still. Whatever was pushing it moved independently of the wind. 51, 52, 53. The swing began moving faster, the arcs growing wider. The chains groaned under increased strain. I kept counting, my voice growing louder as Frank had instructed. 78, 79, 80. At 90, the swing was moving so violently that the entire frame shook. The metal posts had been set deep in concrete decades ago, but they rocked with each swing. Rust flakes fell like snow. 98, 99, 100. I took a deep breath. Ready or not, here I come. The swing stopped instantly, hanging motionless, as if it had never moved at all. I rushed back inside and threw the deadbolt. Through the window, I watched the swing set for another 10 minutes. It remained perfectly still. At 3:30 a.m., I climbed to the 2nd floor for another check of room 237. The hallway stretched before me, lit by emergency lighting that made everything look sickly and washed out. Water damage had stained the ceiling tiles brown, and several had fallen to reveal the darkness above. The door to room 237 was open, not just unlocked, wide open, revealing a black rectangle that seemed to absorb the light from the hallway. The padlock lay on the floor, its metal loop cut clean through. I didn't hesitate. Frank's words echoed in my mind. "If it's open, leave immediately." I ran. Down the stairs, through the main corridor, past the security desk. I didn't stop until I reached my car in the parking lot. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys and started the engine. The radio crackled to life as I backed out of the space. Frank's voice, urgent and concerned. "Danny? Danny, come in. What's your status?" I grabbed the radio. "Room 237 is open. The lock's been cut. I'm in the parking lot." "Good boy. Stay there. I'm on my way." While I waited, I watched the building from the safety of my Honda Accord. Most of the windows were dark, but a few showed the pale glow of emergency lighting. Nothing moved in the visible corridors. Frank arrived 20 minutes later in his pickup truck, accompanied by two other men I didn't recognize. One carried a heavy toolbox. The other had what looked like a small bag of salt or sand. They disappeared into the building for almost an hour. When they emerged, Frank walked over to my car. "All set," he said. "New locks on the door. Whatever got out is back where it belongs." "What was in there, Frank?" He studied my face in the dome light. "Some questions are better left unanswered, Danny. What matters is that you followed the rule. You left when you were supposed to leave. And if I hadn't?" Frank's expression grew grim. "Remember my nephew? The one who's catatonic now? He was the one who opened that door." The rest of my shift passed without incident. I returned to the security desk and monitored the cameras until dawn broke over the Susquehanna Valley. The morning light made everything look normal again. Just an old building full of empty rooms and forgotten memories. But I knew better now. The rules weren't corporate policy or insurance requirements. They were instructions for coexisting with something that refused to stay buried in the past. When Frank returned at 6 a.m. to relieve me, I handed over the keys and logbook without a word. He studied my entries, nodding approvingly at each notation. "You did good tonight, Danny. Real good." As I drove home down Mill Street, I could see the asylum in my rearview mirror, its broken windows catching the morning sun. It looked harmless in daylight, just another piece of Pennsylvania's abandoned industrial heritage. I knew I'd be back that evening, and every evening after, until something decided I wasn't welcome anymore. 3 weeks into the job, I developed a routine. Clock in at 9 p.m., coffee by 9:30, first patrol by 10. The rules had become second nature, muscle memory responses to stimuli I was learning to recognize. The payphone's ring pattern, the elevator's distinctive groan, the particular stillness that preceded the swing's movement. But Tuesday night was different. I arrived to find Frank waiting in the parking lot, smoking nervously beside his truck. His usual calm demeanor had cracked, revealing something close to panic underneath. "Danny, we need to talk." He led me to the picnic table behind the maintenance shed, away from the building's looming presence. The October air carried the smell of burning leaves from somewhere down in town. "Corporate's sending an inspection team tomorrow," Frank said. "Some hotshot from the insurance company wants to evaluate our security protocols." So they're planning a midnight walkthrough. Frank's cigarette trembled between his fingers. "They want to see how we handle overnight operations." The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. "Frank, they can't be here during the active hours. The rules." "I know." I tried to explain. But how do you tell a guy in a suit that his policyholders are paying to keep ghosts locked up? Frank took a long drag. "He thinks we're running some kind of scam. Fake security reports to justify our salaries." "What do we do?" Frank's expression was grim. "You follow the rules like always. I'll try to keep them in the office areas, away from the triggers. But Danny," he met my eyes, "if something goes wrong, if they ignore my warnings and wander off, you protect yourself first. You hear me?" I nodded, though my stomach was already twisting with dread. Frank left at 9:45 p.m., earlier than usual. "Good luck," he said, and I could tell he meant it. The first hour passed quietly. I completed my initial patrol, checked room 237, locked and secure, and settled in at the security desk. The cameras showed empty corridors and vacant rooms. Everything appeared normal. At 11:15 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Insurance guy running late. Pushing visit to 1 a.m. Stay sharp." That gave me time to prepare. I double-checked the radio, made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries, and reviewed the rules one more time. If Frank could keep the inspector away from the trigger zones, maybe we could get through this without incident. The basement singing started at 11:47 p.m. This time it was different. Not the classical aria from my first night, but something childlike and playful. "Ring Around the Rosie" echoed up through the ventilation system, sung by what sounded like a dozen young voices. I cranked the radio to static, drowning out the melody. The white noise filled the lobby, but I could still feel the singing underneath it, vibrating through the building's bones. At midnight, I started my patrol of the upper floors. The children's ward was off limits for another 2 hours, so I focused on the administrative wing. Patient files still lined the shelves in some offices, their manila folders thick with decades of forgotten lives. The bathroom on the 3rd floor had a large mirror above the sink basin. I'd avoided looking at it directly during previous shifts, remembering rule number 6 about the woman in the blue dress. But tonight, as I passed by, movement in my peripheral vision made me glance over. She was there, standing behind my reflection, wearing a nurse's uniform from another era. Blue dress with white collar and cuffs, hair pinned back in victory rolls. Her face was pale and serious, eyes focused on something beyond the mirror's surface. I jerked my gaze away and kept walking. Rule number 6 was clear. Never acknowledge the woman in the blue dress who appears in mirrors after midnight. But as I continued down the hallway, I could feel her watching me through every reflective surface, windows, the glass doors of abandoned offices, even the polished nameplate outside the former director's office. At 12:30 a.m., Frank called. "We're here. Parking now. His name's Davidson, and he's already asking questions about our unconventional procedures. I'm going to try to keep this to the main lobby." "Copy that. Danny? Whatever happens, stick to the rules. Don't let him pressure you into breaking protocol." The line went dead. I positioned myself at the security desk and waited. Through the main entrance, I could see headlights in the parking lot. 2 figures approached the building, Frank's familiar silhouette and a taller man in what looked like an expensive coat. Frank's key turned in the lock, and they entered. The inspector was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-40s, perfectly styled hair, the kind of confident posture that comes from never having your worldview challenged by anything genuinely inexplicable. "Mr. Davidson, this is Danny Kowalski, our night security specialist," Frank said. Davidson's handshake was firm and dismissive. "Mr. Kowalski, I've been reviewing your incident reports. Quite creative, I must say. Sir? Phantom elevator rides? Mysterious phone calls? Moving playground equipment?" Davidson's smile was condescending. "I appreciate your imagination, but my company needs to see actual security work, not ghost stories." Frank stepped forward. "Mr. Davidson, if we could just stick to the office areas." "Nonsense. A proper inspection requires examining all zones." Davidson pulled out a tablet and began reviewing floor plans. "I want to see these areas you've marked as restricted access. Building C, Level 3. Room 237, the basement levels." My blood turned to ice water. "Sir, those areas are off limits during night shifts for safety reasons." "Safety reasons?" Davidson's laugh was sharp. "Mr. Kowalski, I've inspected security operations in maximum security prisons. I think I can handle an empty building." The payphone in the west corridor rang at exactly 12:47 a.m. The sound echoed through the lobby, cutting through Davidson's lecture about proper security protocols. "What was that?" he asked. Frank and I exchanged glances. "Old building," Frank said. "Electrical issues." The phone rang a second time. Davidson was already walking toward the sound, tablet in hand. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Unexplained phenomena that you've attributed to supernatural causes instead of investigating properly. Mr. Davidson, please don't. I started to follow him. The third ring echoed down the corridor. Davidson reached the payphone and lifted the receiver before I could stop him. Hello? Hello, this is James Davidson with Mutual Security Insurance. To whom am I speaking? His confident expression wavered. The color drained from his face. I don't understand. Who is this? How do you know that name? Frank reached him first, grabbing the phone and hanging it up, but the damage was done. Davidson stood frozen, staring at the handset, like it had grown teeth. What did you hear? Frank asked quietly. Davidson's voice was barely audible. She knew about Emily. She knew about the accident. But that's not possible. The records were sealed. The elevator in Building A groaned to life, its motor echoing through the connecting corridors. Davidson spun toward the sound, his professional composure cracking completely. Mr. Davidson, I said, we need to get you out of here, now. But he was already walking toward Building A, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't understand. Frank and I followed, trying to convince him to leave, but Davidson seemed hypnotized by the elevator's mechanical sounds. The brass doors stood open when we reached the lobby. The car was empty, waiting. This is a standard passenger elevator, Davidson said, his voice gaining strength. There's nothing supernatural about mechanical malfunction. He stepped inside before either of us could react. The doors closed with a pneumatic hiss. Frank grabbed the radio. Danny, get the emergency stop key from the maintenance office. Building A, East Wing. I ran through the connecting tunnel, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The maintenance office was locked, but Frank had given me a master key during my first week. Inside, rows of keys hung on labeled hooks. I found the elevator emergency stop and raced back to Building A. The floor indicator showed the car ascending. Second floor, third floor, fourth. Frank was trying to radio Davidson, but getting no response. Mr. Davidson, please acknowledge. Return to the ground floor immediately. The elevator reached the 6th floor and stopped. Then it began descending. Frank, I said, rule number 5. We need to turn around. Forget the damn rules. There's a man in that elevator. But I remembered what Frank had taught me. The rules weren't suggestions. They were survival instructions. I positioned myself facing away from the elevator doors and waited. The car descended slowly. 5th floor, 4th floor, 3rd. Frank was still trying to reach Davidson on the radio. James, if you can hear this, respond immediately. 2nd floor, 1st floor. The elevator reached the ground level with a mechanical wheeze. The doors opened behind us. Footsteps emerged from the car. Not one set, but many. A shuffling procession that moved past us toward the main building. I could hear Davidson's voice among them, but it sounded different. Flat and emotionless. Thank you for visiting, he said. Thank you for visiting. Thank you for visiting. The footsteps faded into the distance. When I finally turned around, the elevator was empty. The floor was covered in wet leaves that smelled like October rain, though none of the windows in Building A were broken. Frank tried calling Davidson's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. We searched the building for 3 hours, calling his name and checking every room we could safely access. The children's ward remained off limits until 4 a.m., and we weren't about to break that rule, not after what had already happened. At dawn, we found Davidson's tablet in the main lobby, its screen cracked and displaying only static. His car was still in the parking lot, keys locked inside. The The police report listed him as a missing person. The insurance company sent a replacement inspector the following week, but Frank convinced them to schedule the visit during daylight hours. That night, I learned that some rules exist for reasons beyond human understanding, and breaking them carries consequences that extend far beyond the rule breaker himself. Davidson's voice still echoes in the corridors sometimes, always saying the same thing. "Thank you for visiting." I never answer him. Davidson's disappearance made the local news. The Danville Morning Press ran a front-page article about the missing insurance investigator, complete with his corporate headshot, and quotes from the police chief about ongoing search efforts. They interviewed Davidson's wife, who described him as a meticulous professional, who would never abandon his responsibilities. I read the article over breakfast at Mickey's Diner on Bloom Street, surrounded by the morning conversations of truckers and shift workers heading home from the Geisinger night shift. Nobody mentioned the asylum. In Danville, some subjects remained off limits even in casual conversation. Frank called me that afternoon. Corporate's sending a new security coordinator, some woman named Patricia Volkov from their Philadelphia office. She'll be here Friday to review our protocols. Another inspection? Different kind. She specializes in what they call high-risk facilities. Prisons, abandoned industrial sites, places with unusual incident reports. I met Patricia Volkov at the main gate Friday evening. She was nothing like Davidson, mid-50s, graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing steel-toed boots, and carrying a canvas messenger bag that looked like it had seen actual use. "Mr. Kowalski?" Her handshake was firm, but not performative. "I've reviewed your reports. Very thorough documentation." Frank emerged from the security office, visibly relieved. "Ms. Volkov, thank you for coming." "I've worked facilities like this before," she said, studying the asylum's facade. "The Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, Willowbrook State School in New York. I understand the complexities involved." Frank nodded. "Then you know why we have the protocols." "I do. And I'm not here to question them. I'm here to make sure you have adequate support for maintaining them." She spent an hour reviewing our equipment and procedures. Unlike Davidson, she asked practical questions about radio range, flashlight battery life, and emergency contact procedures. When Frank showed her the rule list, she read it carefully, without commentary. "Mr. Kowalski, how long have you been following these protocols?" 6 weeks. Any violations?" I thought about the Davidson incident. 1. An outside party who refused to follow instructions. Outcome? Missing person. Case is still open. Volkov made a note in her tablet. "I see. Mr. Peterzak, I'd like to review your historical incident reports. Mr. Kowalski, I'll observe your shift tonight. I won't interfere with your procedures." Frank started to object, but Volkov held up a hand. "I'll follow all protocols exactly as written. I'm here to witness, not to test." That night, Volkov positioned herself at the secondary monitor station Frank had set up in the corner. She wore all black clothing and soft-soled shoes that made no sound on the linoleum floors. When I started my first patrol, she followed at a respectful distance, taking notes, but never speaking. The basement singing began at 11:23 p.m. Volkov was standing beside me when the first notes drifted up through the ventilation system, a lullaby this time, soft and melancholy. I reached for the radio dial. "Wait," she said quietly. "Let me hear it first." The melody was hauntingly beautiful, performed by what sounded like a children's choir. The voices blended perfectly, rising and falling in harmonies that made my chest ache with inexplicable sadness. Volkov listened for 30 seconds, her expression thoughtful. Then she nodded. Proceed with your protocol." I turned the radio to static, drowning out the singing. Volkov made notes in her tablet but didn't ask questions. At midnight, we encountered the woman in the blue dress. I was checking the third-floor administrative wing when I caught movement in the mirror outside the former medical director's office. Volkov was behind me, watching as I carefully avoided making eye contact with the reflection. The woman stood in her usual position, just behind and to the left of my reflected image. Tonight she looked more solid somehow, more present. Her nurse's cap was perfectly starched, and I could see individual buttons on her dress uniform. "Rule number 6, I whispered to Volkov. Volkov observed for a moment, then stepped closer to the mirror. I grabbed her arm. "Don't acknowledge her." "I understand." But Volkov continued studying the reflection. "She's wearing a 1940s uniform. Probably worked here during the wartime period." We moved away from the mirror, but I could feel the woman's presence following us through every reflective surface we passed. Volkov documented everything without breaking protocol. The payphone rang at 12:47 a.m., exactly on schedule. Volkov watched me answer on the third ring and hang up immediately. She checked her watch and made another note. "Consistent timing," she said. "Daily occurrence?" "Every night, 3 rings, always at the same time." "And if you don't answer?" "I don't know. I follow the rules." At 1:30 a.m., we approached the children's ward. The cheerful animal mural looked garish under the emergency lighting, their painted smiles distorted by years of peeling paint and water damage. "Rule number 1, I told Volkov. We can't enter between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. "What happens during those hours?" "I don't know. I've never tested it." Volkov studied the entrance to the ward, then checked her watch. 27 minutes until the restriction period begins. "Can we do a preliminary sweep?" I hesitated. The rules didn't specifically prohibit entering before 2 a.m., only during the restricted hours. But something about the ward felt different tonight. More active, more aware of our presence. "Quick look," I agreed. The children's area stretched down a long corridor lined with small patient rooms. Volkov used a small LED pen light to examine the faded decorations and abandoned toys. Everything looked normal until we reached the playroom at the end of the hall. Someone had arranged the toys. During my previous visits, the room had been chaotic. Blocks scattered, dolls lying in random positions, the rocking horse facing the wall. Now everything was organized. The blocks formed neat towers. The dolls sat in a perfect circle, their glassy eyes all turned toward the entrance. The rocking horse faced us directly, its painted eyes seeming to track our movement. Volkov photographed the scene with her phone. Recent arrangement? It wasn't like this 3 days ago. She examined the dust patterns around the toys. Multiple small handprints in the dust. Child-sized. A grandfather clock in the corner began chiming 2 a.m. The sound reverberated through the empty rooms like a warning bell. "Time to leave," I said. As we walked back toward the entrance, I heard something behind us. Soft footsteps, multiple steps, keeping pace with our retreat. Children's footsteps. Volkov heard them too. She glanced back once, then quickened her pace without commenting. We cleared the ward entrance at 2:02 a.m. Behind us, the corridor fell silent. "That was cutting it close," Volkov said. For the next 2 hours, we patrolled the other buildings. The elevator in Building A remained dormant. Room 237 stayed locked. The swing set in the courtyard was motionless. At 4 a.m., I started to lead us back toward the children's ward for a post-restriction check, but Volkov caught my arm. "Look at Building D." Lights flickered in the windows of the 4th floor. Not electric lights, something warmer, more organic. like candles or oil lamps moving from room to room. I grabbed the radio. "Frank, this is Danny. We have lights in Building D, 4th floor. Multiple sources, moving pattern." Frank's voice crackled back immediately. "Both of you get to the parking lot. Now don't look back. Don't investigate. I'm on my way." We ran, through the main building, past the security desk, out into the cold October air. From the parking lot, we could see the lights more clearly. They moved in a systematic pattern, room to room, as if someone was conducting a thorough search of the building. Frank arrived 15 minutes later with the same 2 men who'd helped him after the room 237 incident. They went into Building D carrying equipment I couldn't identify. Volkov and I waited in my car, watching the lights continue their methodical progression through the upper floors. "Ms. Volkov," I said, "what kind of insurance company are you really with?" She was quiet for a long moment. The kind that understands some risks can't be eliminated, only managed. The lights in Building D went out all at once. Frank and his team emerged 20 minutes later, looking grim but satisfied. "All clear," Frank radioed. "Whatever was stirring has settled down." The rest of the shift passed quietly. At dawn, Volkov packed her equipment and prepared to leave. "Your protocols are sound," she told Frank. "Mr. Kowalski shows excellent adherence to safety procedures. I'll recommend continued funding for your operation." As she drove away, Frank lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Danny," he said, "I've been doing this for 20 years. That was the most activity I've ever seen in one night." "What does that mean?" Frank stared at the asylum, its windows catching the morning light like watching eyes. "It means something's changing." The weather turned nasty the following Tuesday. November had arrived with freezing rain that turned the asylum grounds into a skating rink. Ice coated every surface, making the broken windows look like crystalline teeth. I'd brought extra coffee and a heavy jacket, expecting a long, cold night. Frank met me in the parking lot, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "Storm's supposed to get worse," he said. "Power's been flickering in town all afternoon. If we lose electricity here, the backup generator should kick in automatically." "What about the rules if the power goes out?" "Same rules apply. Generator powers the essential systems. Emergency lighting, elevator motor, that damn payphone." Frank handed me a spare flashlight. "But Danny, if something goes wrong tonight, if the backup fails, you get out. Don't try to maintain protocols in complete darkness." The first sign of trouble came at 9:45 p.m., 15 minutes after Frank left. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. But something felt different about the building's atmosphere. The usual settling sounds, creaking pipes, the whisper of air through broken windows, seemed muted, as if the storm outside had wrapped the asylum in cotton. I started my first patrol early, wanting to check all systems before the weather got worse. The basement level showed signs of water intrusion. Dark stains spread across the ceiling tiles where the old roof leaked, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. That's when I found the footprints. Wet shoe prints tracked across the dusty floor, leading from the stairwell toward the utility room. They were small, child-sized, and still damp. Each print showed the distinctive tread pattern of sneakers, with small gaps where stones might have been lodged in the sole. I followed the trail to the utility room door. It stood slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed during my previous visits. The footprints continued inside, circling the room once before disappearing near the old boiler. My radio crackled. Frank's voice, distant and staticky. "Danny, how's your power situation?" "Stable so far. But Frank, I've got fresh footprints in the basement, child-sized." "What's your location?" "Utility room." Basement level. Long pause. Danny, get out of the basement. Now don't use the elevator. Take the stairs and don't look back. I didn't question him. The footprints were still visible as I headed for the stairwell, but now they seemed to multiply. More prints appeared as I watched, as if invisible children were walking beside me, keeping pace with my retreat. The stairwell door slammed shut behind me with a metallic bang that echoed through the building. At 10:30 p.m., the power went out. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the complex, bathing everything in that familiar sickly yellow glow. Through the windows, I could see that the entire hillside was dark. The storm had knocked out power to this section of Danville. The generator kicked in with a diesel rumble that I felt through the floor. Essential systems came online: the security monitors, the elevator motor, climate control for the main building. But the basement level remained dark on my screens. The payphone in the west corridor rang at 10:47 p.m., exactly 1 hour early. I hesitated. The rules specified answering on the third ring at the scheduled time, but this was outside the normal pattern. The phone rang again. On the third ring, I lifted the receiver. Static filled the line, but underneath it, I could hear voices. Multiple voices, overlapping and urgent. Children's voices. "Hello?" I said. The static cleared. A young girl spoke, her words careful and measured. "The water's coming up. We can't get out. Please help us." "Who is this? Where are you?" "In the dark place, under the building. The water's getting higher." The line went dead. I tried calling Frank, but my radio produced only static. The storm was interfering with transmission, or something else was jamming the signal. I was alone with whatever was happening in the building. At 11:15 p.m., the elevator in Building A activated. I watched the floor indicator climb from the basement to the ground level, then continue upward. 3rd floor, 4th floor, 5th. It stopped at the 6th floor, the old administrative level that had been sealed off for years. According to Rule 5, I should have positioned myself facing away from the elevator when it returned, but the rules didn't cover what to do when the elevator stopped at floors that were supposed to be inaccessible. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for Building A. The connecting tunnel was darker than usual, with only emergency lighting to guide my way. Ice had formed on the windows, creating fractured patterns that split my flashlight beam into fragments. The elevator indicator showed the car was still on the 6th floor. I pressed the call button, but nothing happened. The motor was silent. That's when I heard the singing. Not from the basement this time, but from above. Children's voices drifted down through the elevator shaft, singing something I recognized from my childhood. Jesus loves the little children. But the tempo was wrong, dragged out like a funeral dirge. I found the stairwell and began climbing. The emergency lighting on the upper floors was minimal, just enough to see the steps and handrails. By the time I reached the 6th floor, the singing had stopped. The hallway stretched into darkness in both directions. Water damage had warped the floor tiles, creating ripples and humps that caught my flashlight beam. Most of the office doors stood open, revealing rooms filled with abandoned furniture and filing cabinets. At the end of the corridor, light spilled from beneath a closed door. Not electric light, something warmer and more organic. It flickered like candles or oil lamps, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As I approached, I could hear voices inside. Children's voices, but speaking normally now, not singing. The nameplate beside the door read, Dr. Margaret Henley, Chief of Pediatric Services. I pressed my ear to the door. The voices were clearer now. Told us to wait here. The water's coming up fast. Said someone would help us. Been waiting so long. My hand moved toward the doorknob before I stopped myself. This wasn't covered by any of the 8 rules. I was in uncharted territory, operating without protocol. The voices fell silent, as if they'd sensed my presence. "Hello?" A girl's voice, the same one from the phone call. "Is someone there? Can you help us?" I backed away from the door. Whatever was happening on the 6th floor was beyond my understanding, beyond the safety net of Frank's rules. I needed to get back to the security desk and try to reach him again. The return trip down the stairwell felt longer than the ascent. Shadows seemed to move independently of my flashlight beam, and I could hear footsteps echoing from the floors above. Small feet running through corridors that were supposed to be empty. Back in the main building, I found chaos. The security monitors showed activity throughout the complex. Figures moved through the hallways of buildings B and C, small figures that appeared on camera for just a moment, before vanishing into static. The basement level remained dark, but I could see water flowing across the floor in several locations. The woman in the blue dress appeared on every monitor simultaneously. She stood in corridors, patient rooms, and stairwells throughout the complex. Not reflections this time, but physical presence captured by the security cameras. In each location, she faced the camera directly, as if looking through the lens at me. Rule 6 prohibited acknowledging her, but this went far beyond anything the rules addressed. She was everywhere, multiplying across the building like a viral infection. The payphone rang again. Not the scheduled time. It was only 11:52 p.m., but it rang with the familiar 3-ring pattern. I answered on the 3rd ring. "The children need help." The woman's voice was calm and professional, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "They've been trapped since the flood of 1972. You're the first person who's been able to hear them." "What flood?" "Hurricane Agnes. The Susquehanna overflowed its banks. The basement levels flooded during evacuation. 17 children were left behind in the confusion." I checked the monitors again. The water in the basement was rising visibly now, dark liquid spreading across the floors like oil. "What do you want me to do?" "Help them. They're still down there, waiting for someone to lead them out. They're dead. They've been dead for 50 years. Death is just another room, Mr. Kowalski. And sometimes people get lost trying to find the exit." The line went dead. The building shuddered around me. Not from the storm outside, but from something internal. A deep rumbling that came from the basement levels. On the monitors, I watched water pour through broken windows and damaged foundations, filling the lower corridors with murky floodwater. The elevator in Building A groaned to life again. This time it descended past the ground floor, down to the basement level. The floor indicator showed B1, then B2, sub-basements that weren't supposed to exist. I made a decision that went against everything Frank had taught me. I went to help them. The basement stairwell was flooded to the 3rd step. The water was surprisingly warm, and it smelled like river silt and old leaves. I waded in, my flashlight creating a cone of visibility in the murky depths. The utility room was completely submerged, but through the water, I could see them. 17 children in 1970s clothing, standing calmly on the flooded floor, as if breathing water was the most natural thing in the world. They looked at me with hopeful expressions, their faces pale but peaceful. The girl who'd spoken on the phone stepped forward. She was maybe 8 years old, wearing a yellow dress with white trim. "Are you here to help us?" she asked, her voice clear despite being underwater. "Yes," I said, though I had no idea how. "We've been waiting so long. The nurse said someone would come back for us, but nobody ever did." Behind her, the other children moved closer. Boys and girls of various ages, all watching me with the same hopeful expectation. They looked so normal, so alive. that it was easy to forget they'd been dead for decades. "Follow me," I said. They formed a line behind me as I led them through the flooded corridors. The water level began dropping as we moved, receding like a tide in reverse. By the time we reached the stairwell, the floor was merely damp. I led them up to the main level, through the connector tunnel, out into the storm. The children walked silently behind me, their feet making no sound on the wet pavement. In the parking lot, a school bus waited, yellow and black, with Danville Area School District painted on the side. The door stood open, warm light spilling from the interior. The woman in the blue dress stood beside the bus. She was solid now, no longer confined to mirrors and reflections. She smiled as the children approached. "Thank you," she said to me. "They can go home now." One by one, the children climbed aboard the bus. The girl in the yellow dress was last. She turned to me before stepping inside. "Will you be okay?" she asked. "I think so." "Good. The nurse says you're brave." The bus door closed with a pneumatic hiss. The engine started, and the vehicle pulled away into the storm, its taillights disappearing into the darkness beyond the asylum gates. I stood alone in the parking lot, soaked by freezing rain, wondering if I'd just experienced a breakdown or a miracle. When I returned to the security desk, all the monitors showed empty corridors. The basement levels were dry. The woman in the blue dress had vanished from every reflective surface. The payphone never rang again. The power came back at 3:17 a.m., flooding the asylum with harsh fluorescent light that made everything look exposed and vulnerable. I sat at the security desk, staring at the monitors, trying to process what had just happened. The basement cameras showed dry corridors and empty rooms, no trace of the flood that had filled those spaces just hours earlier. My clothes were still damp from wading through that water. My shoes squelched when I walked. The physical evidence was real, even if everything else felt like a fever dream. Frank arrived early, his truck sliding slightly on the icy parking lot as he pulled up to the main entrance. Through the windows, I watched him hurry toward the building, his expression grim. The radio had been working again since the power returned, and I'd finally been able to reach him with a condensed version of the night's events. "Danny," he said, pushing through the door with a gust of cold air. "Are you hurt? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Confused, but fine." Frank studied my face in the harsh light. "Tell me exactly what happened. Everything." I walked him through the timeline, the early phone call, the footprints in the basement, the children's voices, the woman in blue. Frank listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "You went into the flooded basement," he said finally. "You helped them." "Yes." "Danny, you understand what you did. You broke every protocol we have. You engaged with entities that should never be acknowledged." "They were just kids, Frank. They've been trapped down there for 50 years. Frank lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "And now they're gone?" "I think so. The building feels different, quieter." We spent the next hour checking every system, every camera angle, every trigger point for the original 8 rules. The basement remained dry and empty. The elevator in Building A sat dormant on the ground floor. The payphone in the west corridor was silent. Most telling of all, the woman in the blue dress had vanished completely. Every mirror, every reflective surface showed only our own images. For the first time since I'd started working here, the building felt like just a building. Abandoned, certainly, but no longer actively haunted. 50 years, Frank said, stubbing out his cigarette. She waited 50 years for someone who could hear them. The nurse? Margaret Hemley. I looked her up after you described her uniform. She was head of pediatric services when Hurricane Agnes hit. Official reports say she evacuated all the children safely before the flooding started. Frank paused, but there were always rumors. 17 kids who were supposed to be transferred to other facilities but never arrived at their destinations. They got left behind, lost in the chaos. Agnes was the worst flood in Pennsylvania history. The Susquehanna crested at 32 feet in Danville. This whole area was underwater for days. As dawn approached, we completed one final sweep of the complex. The children's ward felt empty in a way it never had before. The playroom where toys had been mysteriously arranged now showed only dust and neglect. The rocking horse faced the wall again, its painted eyes dull and lifeless. Building D remained dark, its windows reflecting only the pale morning sky. Room 237 was locked and secure. Even the swing set in the courtyard seemed less ominous, just rusted playground equipment surrounded by dead leaves. "So what happens now?" I asked. Frank was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. The rules were designed around specific entities, specific threats. If those threats are gone..." He trailed off, looking around the empty corridors. "Maybe we don't need the rules anymore. Maybe. Or maybe we've just changed the nature of what we're dealing with." That night, I returned to work expecting a normal shift. No rules to follow, no supernatural encounters to navigate. Just 8 hours of watching empty hallways and making sure no one stole copper pipe. It was the longest night of my life. Without the structure of the protocols, without the adrenaline of managing supernatural encounters, the job became exactly what Davidson had accused it of being, sitting alone in an empty building, watching nothing happen. The silence was oppressive. I'd grown accustomed to the basement singing, the elevator's mysterious activations, even the woman in the blue dress appearing in mirrors. Those phenomena had given the building personality, made it feel alive despite its abandonment. Now, it was just dead space. At 11:47 p.m., I found myself missing the familiar melody that should have been drifting up from the basement. At 12:47 a.m., I stared at the silent payphone, waiting for rings that never came. The swing set remained motionless all night, no matter how still the air became. Frank found me at dawn, slumped over the security desk, with my head in my hands. "That bad?" he asked. "Worse." "Frank, I think I made a mistake." "How so?" "The rules weren't just about protection. They were about purpose. They gave meaning to this place, made it more than just another abandoned building rotting on a hillside." Frank poured coffee from his thermos and handed me a cup. "Danny, those weren't benevolent spirits you were coexisting with. They were entities that had claimed territory and established dominance. The rules kept them contained, but they also acknowledged their authority. And now we're in uncharted territory." That Thursday, a real estate developer visited the property. Margaret Schultz from Berwick, representing a company interested in converting the asylum into condominiums. She walked through the buildings with a contractor, discussing renovation costs and market viability. I watched from the security office as they examined the children's ward, the basement levels, even the infamous room 237. They saw everything through commercial eyes: square footage, structural integrity, proximity to downtown Danville. Nothing about their behavior suggested they sensed anything supernatural about the location. "It's just a building now," Frank said, observing their tour on the monitors. "You broke the cycle, freed the spirits, ended the haunting." "Then why do I feel like I've lost something important?" Frank stubbed out his cigarette. "Because you have. This place had history, personality, significance. Now it's just real estate." The developer's crew began preliminary work the following week. They installed new security cameras, upgraded the electrical system, and started clearing debris from the main corridors. The changes were practical, but somehow felt like violations. On Friday night, during what would be my last shift under the old protocols, I walked through the children's ward one final time. The playroom looked smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. Without the mysteriously arranged toys and the sense of invisible presence, it was just another empty room in another abandoned building. I stood at the window overlooking the courtyard, watching the swing set sway slightly in the November breeze. Normal movement now, caused by wind and gravity rather than supernatural intervention. The physics made sense, but the magic was gone. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. Developer wants to hire us for construction security. Daylight hours only. Better pay, normal working conditions. Interested? I typed back, yes, because what else was there to do? The asylum had served its purpose as a way station for lost souls, and I had served my purpose as their guardian. The children had found peace, the nurse had completed her duty, and the building could return to the world of the living. But as I locked up for the final time and walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd solved the wrong problem. The children had needed help, yes, and I had provided it. But in doing so, I dismantled something larger. A delicate ecosystem where the living and the dead had coexisted under carefully negotiated terms. The drive down Mill Street took me past the cemetery where the unclaimed patients were buried. Row after row of small headstones, most marked only with numbers rather than names. Agnes flood victims, longtime residents who died forgotten, casualties of a system that warehoused the inconvenient and the difficult. For 50 years, this building had been their monument, a place where their presence was acknowledged, where careful rituals honored their continued existence in the spaces between life and death. The rules hadn't been restrictions, they'd been recognitions of sovereignty, agreements that allowed multiple realities to coexist in the same physical space. Now the asylum would become luxury housing for young professionals who commuted to Harrisburg or Philadelphia. The dead would be displaced once again, pushed further into obscurity by the relentless advance of development and gentrification. I pulled into my driveway on Ash Street, where the porch light my mother had left on created a small circle of warmth in the November darkness. Inside, the house smelled like pierogies and coffee, familiar scents that reminded me of the world beyond haunted buildings and supernatural protocols. But even as I settled into my normal life, I couldn't stop thinking about the children climbing aboard that phantom school bus. They'd looked so relieved, so grateful to finally be going home after decades of waiting. I hoped they'd found whatever they were looking for. I hoped I hadn't made a terrible mistake in helping them find it. We descended to the basement level, where yellow police tape still marked the scene of Bobby's death. The area had been cleared of equipment, but I could see the ceiling pipes where he'd been found. Fresh gouges in the metal suggested the electrical wire had been wrapped with considerable force. "Ms. Schultz," I said, "I think you should halt construction in this building." "That's not really an option. We have investors, deadlines, city permits. One accident, however tragic, doesn't justify stopping the entire project." But as she spoke, we heard something that made her words trail off into silence. Children's laughter, echoing from somewhere deeper in the basement. It was different from the laughter I remembered from my security shifts. Where the previous sounds had been melancholy and distant, this was sharp and malicious. The kind of laughter that accompanied cruelty rather than joy. "That's impossible," Schultz whispered. "There are no children in this building." The laughter moved through the basement level like water flowing through connected chambers. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the ventilation system and emerging from floor drains. Frank appeared at the basement entrance, his expression grim. "Danny, I need to talk to you. Privately." We left Schultz standing in the basement, still listening to the impossible sounds, and walked to the parking lot. "It's not the same children," Frank said immediately. "What you helped cross over that night. Those were the Agnes flood victims. Innocent kids who got left behind. Then who? The asylum operated for over a century, Danny. 17 flood victims weren't the only children who died here. There were others. Kids who were committed for behavioral problems, for being difficult or unmanageable. Kids who died from neglect, abuse, medical experiments." Frank lit a cigarette with hands that shook worse than I'd ever seen. "The rules we followed all those months, they weren't just containing the flood victims. They were containing everything. All the spirits, all the entities, everything that refused to move on. The innocent ones and the dangerous ones. You're saying by helping those 17 children, you created a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum." Frank took a long drag. "The benevolent spirits moved on, but the malevolent ones stayed behind. Now they have free run of the building, no longer balanced by the presence of protective entities. The implications hit me like physical blows. How many? Hospital records from the early 1900s are incomplete, but my research suggests at least 40 children died under suspicious circumstances between 1923 and 1956. Lobotomies, insulin shock therapy, experimental medications, kids who were committed by families who wanted them gone." We stood in the parking lot, watching construction workers emerge from the building in groups, their faces pale and their voices hushed. Whatever was happening inside was driving them out. "The rules kept them in check," Frank continued. "The children you helped were like guardians. They'd claimed the building first, established territorial rights. The darker entities had to coexist under their terms. And now the asylum belongs to the victims of medical torture and institutional abuse. Kids who died angry, who learned to hate before they learned to die." Margaret Schultz burst through the main entrance, her professional composure completely shattered. She ran to her BMW and fumbled with her keys, hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice. Frank and I approached her car. "Miss Schultz, what happened?" "The basement," she gasped. "The children in the basement. They showed me things. Memories. What this place used to do to kids like them." Her face was ashen, and I could see tears streaming down her cheeks. There were rooms down there. Hidden rooms behind false walls, medical equipment, restraints sized for children. Frank and I exchanged glances. "Ms. Schultz, you need to stop construction immediately." The laughing stopped. She continued, as if she hadn't heard him. Everything went quiet. Then I heard a voice. A little boy. He said they were going to play with the workers the same way the doctors used to play with them. She finally managed to start her car. "I'm calling off the project. Insurance won't cover what's about to happen here." As her BMW disappeared down the access road, Frank and I turned back toward the asylum. The building looked different in the afternoon light, more menacing, more aware of our presence. Windows that should have reflected sky and clouds instead seemed to absorb light, creating dark rectangles that watched us like eyes. "Danny," Frank said quietly, "we need to get those workers out of there." But even as he spoke, we could see it was already too late. The construction vehicle sat empty in the parking lot. Tool belts and hard hats lay scattered across the ground like abandoned armor. From inside the building came sounds of power tools running at full speed, but no human voices directing their use. They're playing with the equipment, I realized. Frank grabbed his radio and tried to reach the construction foreman. Static answered him, filled with the faint sound of children's laughter. We entered the building together, Frank carrying the shotgun he'd retrieved from his truck. The main corridor was chaos. Drop cloths shredded and hanging like spider webs, paint buckets overturned and spreading color across the floors in abstract patterns. The elevator shaft gaped open, its doors torn from their tracks. Fresh elevator cables lay coiled on the floor like metal snakes. From the upper floors came the whine of circular saws and the percussion of nail guns firing in rapid succession. But the sounds were wrong. Too fast, too chaotic, as if children were operating equipment they didn't understand. "We can't go up there," Frank said. "The workers are probably dead, Danny, and if they're not dead yet, they will be soon." As if to punctuate his words, something heavy crashed through the ceiling above us. A construction worker's boot landed on the floor, still laced and tied, but empty of its owner. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. The laughter started again, coming from every direction at once. But now it was joined by other sounds, whispers, crying, the scrape of small fingernails against metal and wood. They're not just malevolent, I realized. They're organized. Frank was already backing toward the exit. "Danny, we need to leave, now." But as we turned to go, I saw something that made my blood freeze. In the windows of the upper floors, small silhouettes were visible. Children's shapes pressed against the glass, watching us retreat. They were planning something, and we had given them the perfect playground to do it in. 6 months later, the Danville State Hospital sits empty again. The construction company filed insurance claims totaling $2.3 million for equipment damage and wrongful death settlements. 5 workers died that day, including Bobby Yankowski. The official reports blamed structural collapse and equipment malfunction, but the families knew better. The lawsuits are still pending. Margaret Schultz sold the property to the county for $1 just to get it off her books. The real estate market in central Pennsylvania couldn't absorb that kind of liability, especially after the local media started asking questions about the building's history. I drive past the asylum every morning on my way to the community college where I teach GEB classes. The chain-link fence has been reinforced with razor wire, and yellow signs warn of dangerous conditions and structural instability. But I know the real danger has nothing to do with crumbling concrete or rusty rebar. Frank retired the week after the construction incident. He moved to Florida to live with his sister, leaving behind 30 years of security work and a lifetime of secrets. We talk occasionally, brief phone calls where we avoid discussing what happened that November night when I chose compassion over protocol. "You did the right thing," he told me during our last conversation. "Those 17 kids deserved peace. It's not your fault that others stayed behind." But I know it's more complicated than that. The asylum's windows remain dark at night, but neighbors report strange sounds. Children's voices carried on the wind, the distant whine of power tools, operated by small hands. The Geisinger Medical Center across the street has had to install soundproofing in rooms facing the hill. Patients complained about hearing laughter from empty buildings. Last month, 3 teenagers broke through the fence on a dea. Only 2 came back out. The third, Jeremy Kovaleski from Riverside, was found 3 days later in the basement of Building C. He was alive but catatonic, sitting in a corner with his knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth. He hasn't spoken since. The police report mentioned evidence of rough play, scratches on his arms that looked like fingernail marks, bruises and patterns consistent with being grabbed by small hands. But Jeremy was alone when they found him. The security cameras that Margaret Schultz had installed showed only empty corridors. I visit Jeremy sometimes at the state hospital in Norristown, where he's receiving treatment. He's 18, just a year younger than I was when I started working security. when I sit beside his bed and speak quietly about normal things, the weather, the Eagles season, life in Danville, his rocking slows and his breathing becomes more regular. I think he knows I understand what happened to him. Dr. Reginald Moss, the psychiatrist treating Jeremy, believes the experience triggered a complete psychological break. Severe trauma, he explained. The mind's way of protecting itself from memories it can't process. But sometimes when I'm sitting with Jeremy in the afternoon sunlight streaming through his hospital room window, he stops rocking and looks directly at me. His eyes are clear and focused, filled with a knowledge that goes beyond psychiatric diagnosis. "They're still playing," he whispered once, so quietly I almost missed it. I knew exactly what he meant. The rules I'd followed for those months weren't just arbitrary protocols. They were a peace treaty, carefully negotiated between the living and the dead. By helping the flood victims find rest, I'd violated the terms of that agreement and upset a balance that had taken decades to establish. Some nights, I dream about that phantom school bus carrying 17 children to whatever peace awaits beyond death. But I wake up thinking about the others, the ones who chose to stay, who turned their pain into power and their suffering into strategy. They're still there, in that building on the hill, playing their games and waiting for the next visitor brave enough or foolish enough to enter their domain. I just hope that when they do, someone will be wise enough to follow the rules